During his rise to power, Hitler was faced with a wide array of obstacles ranging from pesky Democrats to communist militants. By 1934, however, most of these had been dealt with. The opposition was either detained, dead, exiled, or in hiding, and several decrees, such as the Enabling Law, had been passed to help legalize Hitler's seizure of power. The rise of the Third Reich was in part thanks to the paramilitary wing of the Nazi Party, the SA, headed by Ernst Röhm. The SA was largely composed of former Freikorps members, World War I veterans, young men who missed out during World War I, and a wide array of degenerate psychopaths, drunkards, and opportunists. Röhm was somewhat more unique compared to other prominent Nazis. While others, such as Goebbels, were essentially committed to doing whatever Uncle Adolf told them to, Röhm had maintained a greater level of independence and didn't always see eye to eye with Hitler. Despite all that, Röhm and Hitler remained friends, with the latter even addressing Röhm with the less formal "du." If Hitler ever needed someone skull-caved in with a jackboot, then he could rely on Röhm and his SA to do so. However, for as reliable as they were to commit violence, they could also be incredibly unreliable as well. Despite now being part of the police force, there are plenty of cases of SA troops brawling in the streets while drunk with civilians and even law enforcement. One of the reasons why people even voted for the Nazis in the first place was to quell the violence of the Weimar era, violence that the Nazis were, ironically, in part to blame for. Initially, it seemed that these wishes had come true, but by 1934 it appeared to have made a comeback, almost solely at the hands of the SA. This time, Hitler couldn't blame the communists and the Jews for Germany's problems, no matter how hard he tried. One of the reasons for the SA's rowdiness could be that they simply had nothing to do. Any armed opposition against the Nazis had already been taken care of, and most of the important battles for power were occurring at the negotiating table between Hitler and Hindenburg's band of conservatives. It also didn't help that the SA had become 6 times larger at around 3 million members in 1934 than it had been in the previous year. If you take into account other paramilitary groups that they had absorbed, such as the Iron Helmets, the numbers would be at around 4.5 million. This growth was largely because the Nazi Party had stopped accepting new members, fearful of diluting their organization with uncommitted opportunists. However, these restrictions didn't apply to the SA. Relations between the army and the SA continued to worsen once Hitler became Chancellor. On many occasions, Röhm had emphasized the revolutionary nature of Nazism and directed many attacks at people both in and out of the Nazi Party, especially towards army officers, as the SA blamed them for having them banned under the government of Hermann Brüning back in 1931. The army was further alarmed when Röhm declared that he wanted the SA to lay the foundations of a national militia that he would command, eventually replacing the army as a whole. Hitler tried to calm Röhm down by giving him the title of minister, but didn't actually give him any ministry. Unsurprisingly, Röhm wasn't satisfied, refusing to give up his ambition of seizing the Ministry of Defense from General von Blomberg. Still lacking any real power, Röhm began constructing his own cult of personality within the SA, and continued insisting on the need to pursue the revolution. According to General von Blomberg, Röhm had sent him a letter demanding that the army be replaced by the SA, and that they be given the training to assume this role. But this went against the wishes of Hitler, whom wanted to gain the support of the army by expanding the armed forces and pursuing an aggressive foreign policy. In return for this, von Blomberg incorporated Nazi insignia into the army, as well as the expulsion of a small number of Jewish personnel. If Hitler was going to reconquer Germany's lost territories and enact his dream of building an empire in Eastern Europe, he was going to need the support of the army, which was still under the command of conservative generals loyal to President Hindenburg, such as Werner von Fritz and Ludwig von Beck. The conservatives within Hindenburg's government also presented a problem. Despite a majority of the cabinet's ministers being Nazis, the few remaining conservatives still presented an obstacle for Hitler's rise to power. Cooperation between them was made even more difficult due to the misconduct of the SA. Former Chancellor Franz von Papen, still believing that he could manipulate the Nazis into helping form an elitist conservative government, viewed the rampant populism of the SA as an obstacle to achieving that goal. The Nazis also feared that the conservatives would team up with the army to restore order, and maybe even try to take back control of the government after the inevitable passing of President Hindenburg, whom had fallen ill. Aside from pissing off the military and the conservatives, Röhm had also made himself some new enemies from within the party in the form of the SS, headed by Heinrich Himmler, who was also the head of the Gestapo. What started out as a bodyguard unit for high-ranking Nazis soon expanded to a force of 100,000 men. The SS also became more involved in policing duties and created an intelligence service called the SD, headed by Reinhard Heydrich. In theory, the SS was under the command of Röhm, but in reality, it was more like Himmler's own private army. The rivalry between the SA and the SS didn't just stem from a competition for power, but also on a more ideological basis. Due to having their racial pedigree investigated before joining, the members of the SS considered themselves to be elite troops, thus they looked down upon the SA as inferior to them. Wanting to put an end to these rivalries, a meeting was held on the 28th of February 1934 between the SA, SS, and the army. Röhm was forced by Blomberg and Hitler to make a compromise, giving up hopes of replacing the army with the SA. Hitler affirmed that the German military was to be highly professional and well armed, with the SA being relegated to the role of auxiliaries. However, Röhm still insisted in private that he wouldn't accept such ridiculous ends. Clearly not understanding that this type of insubordination is not tolerable in a dictatorship, Röhm had essentially signed his own death warrant, and Hitler had placed him under police surveillance. At first, Hitler only wanted the SA to be put under control and to demilitarize. However, rumors began to circulate about a possible attempt by the SA to create their own state within the state. Some units also began seizing supplies designated for the army, which included stuff like weapons. However, these incidents only occurred on a local level and were not coordinated. While it seemed suspicious, Röhm was by no means organizing a coup. In fact, he had even given permission for the SA to go on leave for the month of July, while he himself took some time off in the town of Bad Weisse due to medical reasons. By doing this, Röhm had unknowingly made him and his whole organization vulnerable to attack, and it wouldn't take long for someone to take advantage of it. For the meantime, Hitler was rather indecisive. During a cruise on a German Navy ship in the month of May, Hitler, Blomberg, and a few others agreed that the SA had to be restrained, but how they would do it was yet to be determined. By the end of June, however, Hitler would be forced to act after Papen had started making his own moves. During a visit to the University of Marburg, Papen gave a speech denouncing Hitler's cult of personality and that the Nazi revolution must come to an end. Unsurprisingly, Hitler was rather pissed. To try and calm down the situation, he once again promised to Papen that he would put the SA under control and stop them from enacting a second revolution. While Papen was naive enough to trust him, it wouldn't be the case if he still failed to do anything. The army then threatened Hitler by saying that if he didn't do something about the SA, then Hindenburg would declare martial law and hand power over to the military. Not having much of a choice, Hitler was forced to plan the downfall of Röhm and his SA. Himmler and Heydrich began fabricating evidence that Röhm was planning a national uprising. On the 24th of June, the evidence was presented to the SS and preparations were made to quell the alleged rebellion. A list of 82 politically unreliable people was drawn up, and Hitler's men were given instructions to execute them. Rudolf Hess even announced on the radio that there were people who planned to betray the Führer. On the 27th of June, Hitler met with Blomberg and General Reichenau to assure the support of the army in the case that the SS needed some assistance. Interestingly, Papen had scheduled a meeting with Hindenburg for the 30th that month, the same day of Hitler's purge. This coincidence had convinced the Nazi higher-ups that something needed to be done about the conservatives. Not wanting to look suspicious, Hitler attended a wedding in Essen and later telephoned Röhm's assistant to set up a meeting between them and other SA leaders in the hotel that Röhm was staying at. Röhm and his men had unknowingly been lured into a trap. Hitler then organized a meeting with Goebbels and Sepp Dietrich, the head of his personal bodyguard unit. He told them that they would take action against Röhm the next day. Hitler was to travel to Bad Weisse to personally take care of Röhm, while Göring would do the dirty work in Berlin. Rumors began circulating, and the SA grew wary. They didn't know what to expect, and took measures to prepare for a possible confrontation with an unknown enemy. In Munich, 3,000 brown shirts staged a demonstration on the 29th and warned that any attempt to attack their organization would be crushed. Similar demonstrations popped up across the country, though they weren't violent and were easily contained. However, no minute could be wasted if the SA was to be successfully subdued. On the night of the 30th, when Hitler arrived in Munich, his first stop was the Bavarian Ministry of the Interior, where the leaders of the aforementioned demonstration were detained. He personally ridiculed the brown shirt leaders for their actions and even threatened to have them executed before sending them off to the Stadtheim prison. Accompanied by Goebbels and his SS bodyguards, he set off to Bad Weisse. When there, they stormed into the Hanselbauer Hotel, where Röhm was staying. According to Erich Kempka, Hitler's driver, the confrontation went as the following. Most of the SA were still sleeping. Hitler then entered the room where Edmund Heinz was in bed with an 18-year-old brown shirt. Heinz and his bang bro were then taken to the laundry room. Hitler and two policemen then go into Rom's room and tell him that he's being detained. Rom, half asleep, then said, "Hail, my Führer," before being told once again that he was under arrest. He was then taken down to the hotel's lobby as Hitler looked at him furiously. The rest of the SA were awakened and suffered a similar experience. Interestingly, Albert Speer would later claim that in a conversation he had with Hitler, he told him that they were unarmed and didn't know if Rom's men would resist, and that they had found two naked boys instead of just one. However, other versions of this conversation have Hitler armed with a revolver. The detainees were then loaded onto the convoy's vehicles and taken to the Stadtheim prison back in Munich. The SA leaders, whom had been called to Munich for a supposed meeting, were then arrested as soon as they reached the train station. Hitler then paid a visit to the Nazi Party's local headquarters and went on a rant about Rom, saying that he had been paid by the French and that he was to be expelled and executed, being replaced by Victor Lutz as head of the SA. But in private, however, his feelings towards Rom were much less hateful. He was still hesitant to kill him, perhaps feeling empathy towards an old friend. Instead of killing him, however, Rom was to be given a revolver to do the dirty work himself. On the 1st of July, Theodor Eicke, the commander of Dachau concentration camp, and another SS thug visited Rom in his cell, gave him a handgun, and told him to take his own life. After waiting 10 minutes, they returned to find Rom still alive, shirtless for some reason, so they had to kill him themselves. Edmund Heinz, the leaders of the demonstration in Munich, and 3 other SA were also sent to the firing squad on orders given by Hitler. The rest of the detainees were then sent to Dachau concentration camp, where they were severely beaten by the camp guards. Interestingly, it seems that those whom Hitler had purged in Munich got off easy, at least compared to other parts of Germany. Heading over to Berlin, Goering hadn't limited himself solely to targeting members of the SA. The SS and the Gestapo in Berlin were given orders to assault the Vice-Chancellery. During the attack, Papin's secretary, Herbert von Boss, was gunned down by the Nazis. His ideological advisor, Edgar Jund, whom had been detained earlier on the 25th of June, was also shot and later thrown into a ditch. Papin himself was put under house arrest for the foreseeable future, only escaping death because he was too important to kill. But other high-profile figures wouldn't be so lucky. Hitler's predecessor, General von Schleicher, was shot dead in his house along with his wife, Elisabeth. Major General von Bredow, whom had criticized the Nazis, was also shot dead while resisting arrest for his complacency in Rom's alleged coup. Another former chancellor, Heinrich Brüning, was also supposed to be executed, but managed to flee to Austria after being alerted by Erich Klausner, whom was the former chief of police, leader of Catholic Action, and current minister of transport. Unfortunately for Klausner, he himself was killed by the SS on orders given by Reinhard Heydrich. Despite having resigned from the party for trying to form a coalition government with Schleicher, Gregor Strasser was killed for these actions. A friend and collaborator of Strasser, Paul Schulz, was hunted down by Goering's men and was taken to a forest to be executed. However, as he was taken out of the car, Schulz made a run for it before being shot. The wound wasn't fatal and he pretended to be dead. When his would-be murderers went back to the car to grab a blanket to wrap him in, he managed to escape. He eventually negotiated with Hitler to allow himself to go into exile. Captain Earnhardt, the leader of a Freikorps unit called the Earnhardt Brigade that had taken part in the Kapp Putsch back in 1920, managed to escape from the police when they entered his home, eventually fleeing to Austria. The following day, the Nazis continued to arrest and execute potential troublemakers, many of which included personal rivals. Gustav Ritter von Kahr, the former head of the Bavarian government whom had refused to support Hitler back in 1923 during the Beer Hall Putsch, was gunned down by the SS. The music critic, Wilhelm Edward Schmid, was mistakenly killed after being confused for Ludwig Schmidt, who was an associate of Gregor Strasser's brother, Otto. The Bavarian politician, Otto Wallerstedt, was detained in Dachau and later executed as he had managed to send Hitler to prison for a month back in 1921. Several high-ranking officers of the SS also took the opportunity to kill their own rivals within the organization. Erich von den Bach-Zaleski had the chief of the SS cavalry, Anton von Hochberg und Buchwald, shot dead in his house. The regional chief of the SS in Silesia, Otto von Busch, personally killed his own rival, Emil Sembach. The violence wasn't just limited to Nazis and conservatives. While they only consisted of a minority of the victims, a handful of Jews were also targeted. In Hirschberg, 4 Jews were killed by the Nazis for supposedly trying to escape. The leader of a Jewish World War I veterans organization was also detained, taken to a forest, and killed. When the dust settled, Hitler was now faced with the task of defending his actions. Goebbels, being a good little lapdog, gave the party's official statement that Röhm had conspired with Schleicher to conduct a second revolution that would have submerged Germany into chaos. In a meeting with the cabinet, Hitler told them that Strasser, Schleicher, and the French government had been conspiring with Röhm for several years to plan a putsch. Even if they were stupid enough to believe him, what Hitler had done was, by all means, illegal, and he still had lots of explaining to do. During a meeting of the Reichstag on the 13th of July, Hitler gave a speech that was broadcasted via radio to the entire nation. The punishment for these crimes was a hard and severe one. As heavy as these sacrifices may be, they are not in vain if they may serve to bring about once and for all the conviction that every attempt to commit treason against the internal and external security of the state will be broken without distinction of person. I am confident in my hope in this respect. If fate were to dismiss me from my post at any hour, my successor would not act differently, and were he also made to vacate his post, that the third in line would exhibit no less determination in his willingness to uphold the security of the Volk and the nation. He basically admitted that what he had done was outside the confines of the law, but that it didn't really matter because, in his own words, it was for the security of the Volk and the nation. Even if you wanted to press charges against them, you wouldn't get too far as, by this time, Hitler was almost in full control of the government. One reason that some people have given for the essay Purge was that Röhm was an appreciator of the thug shaker. While the homosexuality of some brown shirts was used as a justification, it is unlikely that this played a role in Hitler's decision to kill Röhm. His sexuality was no secret after the mid-1920s, and Hitler seemed to have made an exception for him. The press portrayed the Purge following the party's line, calling Röhm's perceived treason as a revolt. Interestingly, the death toll given by some newspapers was incredibly high, such as the one on screen, though as we'll see, it was much lower. The public was, for the most part, supportive of the Purge, believing that it would help restore order in the streets. However, there were still many people who criticized it in private, and rumors began to circulate about Hitler's true intentions. Some were even more open about their criticisms, though they were quickly detained by the police. The death toll given by Hitler on the 13th laid at 74 people, however the true number is no less than 85. After all this death, the question of whether or not the Purge actually put a stop to the violence of the SA still remains. The answer isn't as straightforward as a simple yes. Incidents of street violence still occurred even after the Purge. To give one example, an SA rally in Nuremberg that year resulted in thousands of brown shirts getting absolutely wasted and terrorizing the city. A fight broke out between two groups from different regions. Law enforcement then got involved as they tried to put an end to the violence. In total, about 6 people were killed and 50 injured. The fall of the SA was a gradual one, with members slowly leaving the organization over the course of the next few years. In August 1934, the SA had about 2.9 million members, dropping down to 1.6 million in October 1935 and 1.2 million in April 1938. By the time of World War II, the entry requirements grew stricter, and the Nazis simply began exporting their violence to other countries. The Night of the Long Knives achieved several things, the most important one being that it calmed down the army and assured their loyalty to Hitler. As for the deaths of Schleicher and von Bredel, they were justified by their false involvement in an alleged conspiracy. As for Schleicher's wife, Elizabeth, they didn't seem to care that an innocent woman had lost her life. It also served as a warning to the conservatives. Having 2 of his close associates killed and his own life put in danger, Papen was certainly much less intrigued in seizing power for himself. That's if he even wanted to in the first place. It's unlikely that Röhm would have betrayed Hitler, at least for the time being, but the simple fact that he could think for himself is rather dangerous when trying to establish a dictatorship. Hitler didn't just kill an ally, but also a friend for the sole reason of being an inconvenience. If he was willing to go that far with his own men, then it shouldn't have come as a surprise when he did it to others for less.
Puedes hacer el Ram Shaker, ¿huh? El Thug Shaker. Dame ese Thug Shaker, viejo. Voy ese trasero. Quítate las manos y agita eso. Súbete la camisa. Sé que lo puedes menear. Menéalo. Sí, ese es un culo de matón ahí mismo. Oh sí, funcionará.